Hello there, and welcome to Zzscience, where we explore fascinating science in a gentle, relaxing way that helps your mind unwind and drift off to sleep. Tonight, we're wandering into one of humanity's oldest and most fascinating questions. Can we actually live forever? Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. It's always wonderful to know where these gentle explorations are drifting off to. Tonight, we'll take a soft journey through the mysteries of aging, from the ancient alchemists searching for the elixir of life, to modern scientists peering into our cells, looking for the keys to longevity. We'll meet jellyfish that seem to have cracked the code, explore the ticking clocks hidden in our DNA, and wander through both the promises and puzzles of living indefinitely. We hope this isn't too riveting, because while we'd love to keep your mind gently engaged, the real goal is to guide you toward peaceful sleep. But if you do happen to stay awake a little longer, at least you'll drift off knowing why some trees outlive civilizations, what telomeres are up to in your cells, and whether freezing yourself might actually be a reasonable Tuesday evening plan. So settle in, maybe take a slow, restful breath, and let's begin this quiet exploration of time, mortality, and the beautiful, stubborn human dream of forever. Picture a brand new car, fresh off the lot, gleaming and perfect in every way. Now picture that same car after 100,000 miles of life. The paint has faded a little. There's a small dent from that unfortunate parking incident. The seats have molded to your shape, and the engine doesn't purr quite like it used to. That car hasn't broken down. It's just lived. And in many ways, that's exactly what aging is. The gentle accumulation of a lifetime's worth of living. But unlike cars, which are made of metal and plastic, our bodies are made of something far more remarkable. Billions of cells, each one a tiny, bustling factory working around the clock to keep you breathing, thinking, and occasionally craving chocolate at inappropriate hours. And just like any hard-working factory, these cellular workshops experience a bit of wear and tear over time. At the most basic level, aging is what happens when our body's repair systems can't quite keep up with the daily damage of being alive. Every breath you take creates tiny molecular troublemakers called free radicals, which bounce around your cells like hyperactive children in a china shop. Every meal you digest, every step you take, every thought you think generates a little bit of cellular stress. Most of the time, your body handles this beautifully, like a patient librarian constantly tidying up after enthusiastic readers. But here's where it gets interesting. Inside each of your cells are tiny powerhouses called mitochondria, often called the power plants of the cell. These little organelles convert the food you eat into energy your body can use. Think of them as cellular baristas, constantly brewing up fresh energy to keep you going. But over time, even the best baristas get a bit tired, and mitochondria start to function less efficiently. They produce less energy and, unfortunately, more of those troublesome free radicals. Meanwhile, the proteins in your cells, which do most of the actual work, occasionally fold into the wrong shape, like origami gone slightly awry. Usually, your cells have quality control systems that catch these misfolded proteins and either fix them or recycle them. But as we age, this quality control becomes less reliable, and damaged proteins start to accumulate like unopened mail on a busy person's desk. Your DNA, the instruction manual for your entire body, also takes a beating over time. Cosmic rays from space, ultraviolet light from the sun, and those pesky free radicals we mentioned earlier all cause tiny nicks and breaks in your genetic code. Again, your cells have repair crews for this, molecular mechanics that patch up DNA damage. But occasionally, mistakes slip through, and over decades, these small errors can add up. Now, there's an ongoing scientific debate about whether aging is programmed into us, like a biological alarm clock set to go off after a certain number of years, or whether it's simply the result of accumulated damage, like a house slowly weathering through many seasons. The truth is probably a bit of both. Evolution seems to have prioritized getting us through our reproductive years in good shape, but after that, natural selection becomes less concerned with our maintenance. It's as if nature says, "You've done your bit, passed on your genes, now you're on your own." This shows up in different ways throughout your body. Your immune system, which spent decades fighting off infections with remarkable efficiency, starts to slow down and become less accurate, sometimes even turning against your own tissues. Your cardiovascular system, that intricate network of highways and byways that has pumped blood faithfully for decades, begins to stiffen and narrow. Your bones, which have been constantly rebuilding themselves throughout your life, start to break down faster than they can repair. But here's something wonderful. Aging isn't the same for everyone. Some people seem to glide through their 70s and 80s with grace and vitality, while others struggle earlier. Part of this is genetics, the biological lottery ticket you receive from your parents. But a surprising amount is influenced by how you live, what you eat, how much you move, how well you sleep, how you handle stress, and even how connected you feel to other people. Think of your body as a garden. Some gardens have better soil to start with, but any garden benefits from good care, regular watering, occasional weeding, protection from harsh weather, and perhaps most importantly, attention and love. Your cells respond to kindness, to gentle movement, to nourishing food, to restful sleep. They thrive on routine and wilt under chronic stress. The fascinating thing is that while we can't stop aging entirely, we can influence how we age. Your body is constantly rebuilding itself, replacing old cells with new ones, repairing damage, adapting to change. Even now, as you listen to this, your body is engaged in millions of tiny acts of renewal. Skin cells are regenerating, your liver is detoxifying, your brain is consolidating memories and clearing out metabolic waste. Scientists are beginning to understand that aging isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we participate in. The choices we make, the thoughts we think, the relationships we nurture, all of these influence the aging process at the cellular level. It's not about stopping time, but about aging well, like a fine wine or a beloved book that becomes more beautiful with each passing year. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought of all, that aging, for all its challenges, is also a kind of achievement. Every wrinkle is a map of smiles and squints in bright sunlight. Every grey hair is a strand of wisdom earned through experience. Every slowing step is a testament to all the miles travelled, all the dances danced, all the paths explored. Aging is simply life leaving its gentle marks on us, the way water slowly shapes stone, creating something unique and beautiful and entirely our own. There's a story that's been told in every culture, in every language, across every continent where humans have ever looked up at the stars and wondered, what if we didn't have to die? It's a rather charming bit of human optimism, really. For thousands of years, our ancestors looked at the inevitable end of life and said, surely there must be a way around this. And so began humanity's long, sometimes bizarre, occasionally dangerous quest for immortality. The oldest story we know of that wrestles with mortality comes from ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a king who, upon losing his dear friend Enkidu, became obsessed with avoiding the same fate. He traveled to the ends of the earth, fought monsters, and dove to the bottom of the sea to retrieve a plant that promised eternal youth. But even after all that effort, a serpent stole the plant while Gilgamesh was bathing. The message was clear. Death comes for everyone, even heroes. But humans are stubborn creatures, and one disappointing plant wasn't about to stop the dream. Ancient cultures around the world developed their own theories about how to cheat death. The Egyptians, master engineers that they were, took a practical approach. If the body was going to die, they'd preserve it so well that death couldn't really stick. Mummification wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about creating a vessel that could house the soul for eternity. They built pyramids, those massive stone monuments to the idea that some people, at least, might find a way to last forever. The ancient Greeks had ambrosia, the food of the gods, which supposedly granted immortality to anyone divine enough to taste it. The Chinese developed an entire branch of alchemy dedicated to creating elixirs of life. Unfortunately, many of these elixirs contained mercury, which has the rather counterproductive effect of hastening death, rather than preventing it. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, reportedly died from consuming mercury pills prescribed by his court alchemists. Irony, it seems, has been around as long as humans have been trying to live forever. Medieval Europeans became obsessed with the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that could supposedly transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. Alchemists spent lifetimes hunching over bubbling cauldrons, mixing sulfur and mercury and various exotic ingredients, convinced that the right combination would unlock the secret of immortality. What they actually unlocked was the foundation of modern chemistry, which is arguably more useful, though perhaps less immediately exciting. The search for the fountain of youth became so embedded in European culture that when explorers began sailing to the New World, many were convinced they'd find it there. Ponce de Leon's exploration of Florida was partially motivated by stories of waters that could restore youth. Spanish conquistadors questioned indigenous peoples about magical springs and healing waters. They never found eternal life, but they did find new lands, new cultures, and occasionally very disappointed retirement communities. What's fascinating is how consistent the dream has been across cultures that had no contact with each other. Australian Aboriginal cultures spoke of the rainbow serpent and eternal dreaming. Hindu traditions developed concepts of soma, a divine drink that granted immortality. Norse mythology had the golden apples of Idun, which kept the gods young. Celtic legends told of the otherworld, where time moved differently and aging stopped. These weren't just stories. They reflected a deep human intuition that death wasn't natural, that we were meant for something more permanent. Death felt like a mistake, a glitch in the system that surely someone, somewhere could fix. And in many ways, that intuition wasn't entirely wrong. Humans do live longer than most animals our size. We have remarkable healing abilities, complex immune systems, and brains capable of solving problems that would have seemed impossible to our ancestors. The methods may have been questionable, but the desire was profoundly human. ancient Chinese emperors sent expeditions to find islands where immortals supposedly lived. Indian texts describe yoga and meditation practices that could extend life indefinitely. Islamic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote extensively about elixirs that could grant hundreds of years of life. What's particularly charming is how optimistic these early attempts were. Ancient alchemists weren't deterred by repeated failures. They simply assumed they hadn't found the right formula yet. Medieval monks who copied manuscripts about eternal life didn't see the irony in spending their mortal years transcribing texts about immortality. They had faith that human ingenuity would eventually triumph over biological limitations. Of course, many of these historical attempts were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Mercury poisoning, lead consumption, and various toxic plant extracts probably shortened more lives than they extended. But even the failures contributed something valuable. They established the idea that aging and death were problems worth investigating, puzzles that human intelligence could potentially solve. The interesting thing is that these ancient dreams weren't really that different from our modern scientific pursuits. They just used different tools. Where ancient alchemists mixed metals and herbs, modern scientists mix genes and proteins. Where medieval scholars sought the philosopher's stone, contemporary researchers seek the genetic switches that control aging. The dream is the same, only the laboratory has changed. And perhaps that continuity tells us something important about human nature. We are the species that looks at the inevitable and says, what if it's not? We're the creatures who see death stalking every living thing and respond not with acceptance but with curiosity. What if we could understand it better? What if we could slow it down? What if we could stop it altogether? Those ancient dreamers, with their mercury pills and fountain of youth expeditions, were asking the same questions that keep modern scientists working late into the night. They may not have had electron microscopes or genetic sequencing, but they had something equally powerful, the stubborn human conviction that the impossible is just another word for not yet figured out. In a way, we owe them a debt. Their failures taught us what doesn't work, and their dreams kept the question alive through centuries when the tools to answer it didn't yet exist. They kept the flame burning, passing it from generation to generation, until finally we reached a time when the dream of forever might actually be within reach. If you could shrink down small enough to peek inside your cells, you'd discover something rather unsettling. Your body has been keeping a very precise count of how many times it's allowed to rebuild itself. It's not the kind of timer you can hear ticking, but it's there nonetheless, keeping careful track of how many times your cells have split, reproduced, and renewed themselves. These cellular timekeepers are called telomeres, and they might just hold some of the most important clues about why we age and whether we can do anything about it. Imagine your chromosomes as shoelaces, with telomeres as the little plastic tips that keep everything from fraying. Every time a cell divides to replace itself, the cellular machinery that copies DNA can't quite reach the very ends of the chromosomes. So like a photocopier that cuts off the edges of a document, each cell division trims a little bit off the telomeres. Eventually, these protective caps become so short that the cell can no longer divide safely, and it either dies or enters a state called senescence, where it stops dividing but doesn't die. This discovery was so important that the scientists who figured it out, Elizabeth Blackburn, Carol Greider, and Jack Szostak, won the Nobel Prize in 2009. They revealed that aging, at least in part, is literally built into our cells like a molecular hourglass, counting down the divisions until time runs out. But here's where it gets interesting. Most cells in your body can only divide about 50 to 70 times before their telomeres become critically short. This is called the Hayflick limit, named after Leonard Hayflick, who first observed this phenomenon in the 1960s. It's as if each cell comes with a predetermined lifespan, a built-in obsolescence that ensures it won't keep dividing forever. Except some cells seem to have found a way around this rule. There's an enzyme called telomerase that can actually rebuild telomeres, essentially resetting the cellular clock. This enzyme is active in stem cells, which need to keep dividing throughout your life to replace worn-out tissues. It's also, unfortunately, active in about 90% of cancer cells, which is part of how they manage to divide endlessly and cause so much trouble. Think of telomerase as a cellular fountain of youth, capable of keeping cells young and division-ready indefinitely. Most of your adult cells have very little telomerase activity, which is probably a good thing. If all your cells could divide forever, you'd have a much higher risk of developing cancer. It's a delicate balance. Enough cell division to maintain your tissues, but not so much that cells go rogue. But telomeres are just one part of the cellular aging story. Even if we could keep our telomeres long forever, our cells face other challenges. Remember those mitochondrial powerhouses we mentioned earlier? They have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in your cell's nucleus. And this mitochondrial DNA is particularly vulnerable to damage. Over time, mutations accumulate in mitochondrial DNA, causing these cellular power plants to become less efficient. As mitochondria struggle, they produce less energy and more harmful byproducts. It's like having a car engine that starts burning oil and losing power. Eventually, the whole system becomes less reliable. Some scientists think mitochondrial decline might be one of the primary drivers of aging, the reason why older bodies have less energy and take longer to heal. Then there's the issue of cellular garbage. Throughout your life, your cells accumulate damaged proteins, toxic compounds, and cellular debris. Young cells are generally good at cleaning up this mess, but as cells age, their quality control systems become less efficient. It's like having a house where the cleaning crew gradually becomes less thorough. Over time, the rooms get more cluttered, making it harder for everything to function properly. Your cells also face a constant barrage of damage from the environment. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun causes DNA damage. Chemicals in food, air, and water can interfere with cellular processes. Even the oxygen you breathe, essential for life, creates reactive molecules that can damage cellular components. It's the biological equivalent of rust, a slow oxidation process that gradually degrades the machinery of life. The remarkable thing is that your cells have sophisticated repair systems to deal with most of this damage. DNA repair enzymes constantly patrol your genetic material, fixing breaks and mutations. Antioxidant systems neutralize harmful free radicals. Protein quality control mechanisms identify and remove damaged proteins. For most of your life, these repair systems work so well that you're completely unaware of the constant maintenance happening inside your cells. But repair systems aren't perfect, and they slow down with age. It's like having a maintenance crew that gradually becomes smaller and less efficient over time. Eventually, damage accumulates faster than it can be repaired, and cellular function begins to decline. Interestingly, different types of cells age at different rates. Brain cells, which rarely divide in adulthood, don't have to worry much about telomere shortening, but they're particularly vulnerable to oxidative damage and protein accumulation. Immune cells, which divide frequently throughout life, face rapid telomere shortening, which might explain why older adults are more susceptible to infections and diseases. The good news is that cellular aging isn't entirely beyond your control. Exercise, for instance, seems to boost telomerase activity and improve mitochondrial function. A healthy diet provides antioxidants that help neutralize free radicals. Quality sleep gives your cells time to perform essential repair and maintenance functions. Even managing stress can influence cellular aging, since chronic stress hormones can accelerate telomere shortening. Scientists are also exploring more direct interventions. Some researchers are investigating whether we could boost telomerase activity in adult cells without increasing cancer risk. Others are working on drugs that could clear senescent cells from the body, essentially taking out the cellular trash that accumulates with age. There are experiments with compounds that could improve mitochondrial function or enhance cellular repair systems. But perhaps the most profound insight from cellular aging research is how it connects the microscopic world inside our cells to the macroscopic experience of growing older. Every grey hair, every wrinkle, every moment of feeling a little less energetic than you used to can be traced back to these tiny cellular clocks ticking away inside us. It's oddly comforting to know that aging has a mechanism, that it's not just a mysterious force but a biological process we're beginning to understand. An understanding, as any good scientist will tell you, is the first step toward the possibility of intervention. In laboratories around the world, something remarkable is happening. Scientists are treating aging like any other disease that might, with enough ingenuity and stubbornness, eventually be cured. That's not just wishful thinking. It's actually happening in research facilities around the world, where scientists have moved beyond simply understanding aging to actively trying to slow it down, stop it, or even reverse it. The tools are different from those mercury elixirs and philosopher's stones of the past, but the goal remains delightfully, stubbornly human: to give us more time. The modern scientific assault on aging began with a rather unexpected discovery involving laboratory worms. In the 1990s, researchers working with C. elegans, tiny nematodes that live for about 3 weeks, found that mutations in certain genes could double or even triple the worm's lifespan. Suddenly, aging didn't seem like an immutable law of biology, but more like a software program that could be modified. If you could make a worm live twice as long with a simple genetic change, what might be possible for humans? This led to the discovery of longevity genes, particularly a family called sirtuins, sometimes dubbed longevity genes, in the popular press. These genes produce proteins that seem to coordinate cellular responses to stress and help maintain cellular health. When scientists boosted sirtuin activity in various organisms, the results were often remarkable. Longer lifespans, better health in old age, and resistance to age-related diseases. One of the most promising approaches to emerge from this research is caloric restriction, which sounds less appealing than it actually is. Studies in everything from yeast to monkeys have shown that reducing calorie intake by 20-30% while maintaining proper nutrition can significantly extend lifespan and delay age-related diseases. The mechanism seems to involve triggering cellular stress responses that boost repair systems and improve overall cellular function. It's as if mild, chronic stress makes cells more resilient, like gentle exercise for your cellular machinery. But because most people aren't eager to spend their potentially extended lives feeling perpetually hungry, scientists have been searching for drugs that could mimic the benefits of caloric restriction without the actual restriction. One of the most promising candidates is rapamycin, originally discovered as an antifungal compound from bacteria found in the soil of Easter Island. When researchers gave rapamycin to laboratory mice, they lived longer and stayed healthier in old age, even when treatment didn't begin until the mice were already middle-aged. Another intriguing candidate is metformin, a drug that's been used for decades to treat type 2 diabetes. Epidemiological studies suggest that diabetics taking metformin not only have better blood sugar control, but also seem to live longer and have lower rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease compared to diabetics taking other medications. This led to speculation that metformin might have broad anti-aging effects, and several clinical trials are now testing whether it can extend healthy lifespan in non-diabetic individuals. Then, there's the fascinating world of NAD+, a molecule that's essential for cellular energy production and DNA repair. NAD+ levels decline with age, and boosting them in laboratory animals can improve various markers of aging. This has led to the development of NAD+ precursors like nicotinamide riboside and NMN, which are being tested as potential anti-aging supplements. But perhaps the most exciting frontier is senolytic therapy, which targets senescent cells. Remember those cells that stop dividing but don't die? They accumulate with age and secrete inflammatory compounds that can damage surrounding tissues. Scientists have developed drugs called senolytics that can selectively eliminate these cellular zombies. In laboratory animals, senolytic treatments can improve healthspan, reduce age-related pathology, and in some cases, extend lifespan. Genetic approaches are also advancing rapidly. Scientists have identified people who live exceptionally long lives and are studying their genetics to understand what protects them from age-related diseases. Some centenarians have genetic variants that seem to protect against Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, or cancer. Understanding these protective mechanisms could lead to therapies that provide similar benefits to the rest of us. There's also growing interest in the role of the immune system in aging. As we get older, our immune systems become less effective at fighting infections and more likely to attack our own tissues. This process, called immunosenescence, might be a key driver of aging. Researchers are exploring ways to rejuvenate the immune system, perhaps by boosting the production of new immune cells or clearing out old, dysfunctional ones. Regenerative medicine offers another approach, using stem cells to replace damaged tissues and organs. As our understanding of stem cell biology improves, we're getting better at coaxing these cellular shapeshifters to become whatever type of cell we need. In theory, we might eventually be able to replace worn-out organs with laboratory-grown alternatives, essentially giving ourselves biological spare parts. But it's important to maintain some perspective here. Most of these interventions are still in early stages of development, tested primarily in laboratory animals or small human studies. The jump from extending lifespan in mice to extending lifespan in humans is significant, and what works in the controlled environment of a laboratory doesn't always translate to the complex reality of human biology. There's also the question of whether we're trying to extend lifespan or health span. Living longer isn't necessarily better, if those extra years are spent in poor health? The goal of modern aging research isn't just to add years to life, but to add healthy, vibrant, meaningful years. Nevertheless, the pace of discovery is accelerating. We understand more about the biology of aging now than ever before, and that understanding is starting to translate into potential interventions. For the first time in human history, aging is being approached not as an inevitable fate, but as a medical condition that might be treatable. The researchers working on these problems aren't just motivated by scientific curiosity. Many of them genuinely believe that the first person to live to 150 or 200 or even longer might already be alive today. Whether that turns out to be true remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The question of whether humans can live forever is no longer purely philosophical. It's becoming a matter of applied science, complete with clinical trials, FDA approvals, and the possibility that aging might soon join infectious diseases and nutritional deficiencies as medical problems we've largely solved. What if the secret to living forever isn't about keeping your biological body running indefinitely, but about convincing a computer to think it's you? While biologists work to repair cellular damage and geneticists search for longevity genes, a different group of scientists and visionaries are pursuing immortality through technology. Their plan is simultaneously more radical and more plausible than it initially sounds. Upload human consciousness to computers, or preserve brains so perfectly that future technology might someday bring them back to life. The idea of digital immortality rests on a fundamental assumption about human consciousness, that what makes you you is essentially information processing, patterns of neural activity that could theoretically be copied and run on a different substrate. If your mind is like software running on the hardware of your brain, then perhaps that software could be transferred to a computer that would never age, never get sick, and never wear out. This concept, often called mind uploading or whole brain emulation, has captured the imagination of researchers in artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and computer science. The basic idea is to map every neuron in a human brain, understand how they're connected, and then recreate that entire network in a computer simulation. In theory, this digital version of your brain would think, feel, and remember just like you do, except it would be running on silicon instead of biological neurons. The technical challenges are staggering. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through trillions of synapses. Mapping this network with enough detail to recreate it would require scanning technology far beyond what we currently possess. We'd need to understand not just which neurons connect to which, but also the strength of those connections, the types of neurotransmitters involved, and the complex dynamics of how neural signals propagate through the brain. Some researchers are making progress on smaller scales. Scientists have successfully mapped and simulated the nervous system of C. elegans, that same tiny worm that's taught us so much about aging. The worm's nervous system has only 302 neurons, and researchers have created computer simulations that can control virtual robots with something resembling worm-like behavior. It's a long way from simulating a worm brain to simulating a human brain, but it's a start. Others are taking a different approach entirely. Cryonics, the practice of preserving dead bodies or brains at extremely low temperatures in the hope that future technology might be able to revive them. The logic is appealingly straightforward. We don't currently know how to cure aging reverse death, or repair all the damage that accumulates in aging bodies. But perhaps someday we will. If you can preserve your brain well enough, maybe a more advanced civilization could figure out how to bring you back. Cryonics facilities exist in several countries, storing hundreds of people and animals in liquid nitrogen at temperatures of 196 degrees. At these temperatures, biological processes essentially stop. Cellular decay, chemical reactions, and all the biological clocks that normally tick toward death are frozen in place. The challenge is preservation quality. Current cryonics procedures can only begin after legal death, and the process of freezing and thawing causes significant damage to biological tissues. The more recent development of aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, ASC, represents an attempt to improve preservation quality. This technique uses chemical fixatives to stabilize brain tissue before freezing, potentially preserving fine neural structures better than traditional cryonics. The trade-off is that ASC definitely kills the brain tissue, making it more like creating an extremely detailed photograph of a brain than preserving a potentially revivable organ. But even if we solve the technical problems of brain preservation or mind uploading, philosophical questions remain. Would a digital copy of your brain really be you? Or would it be a different person who simply thinks it's you? If your consciousness is uploaded to a computer, what happens to your sense of continuity? Are you the same person? Or are you a copy who inherited the original's memories? These questions become even more complex when you consider that there's no reason a digital consciousness would be limited to a single copy. You could potentially exist in multiple versions, each developing different experiences and memories after the point of copying. Which one would be the real you? Or would they all be equally valid versions of your consciousness? There are also practical considerations that sound almost comically mundane given the cosmic scope of digital immortality. What happens if there's a power outage? What if the server hosting your consciousness crashes? Would digital beings need some form of data backup? Would consciousness as a service become a subscription model, where you'd need to pay monthly fees to keep existing? Despite these challenges, serious researchers and well-funded companies are pursuing various forms of technological immortality. Neuralink, founded by Elon Musk, is developing brain-computer interfaces that could eventually allow direct neural connection to computers. While their immediate goals are medical, helping paralyzed patients control devices with their thoughts, the technology could theoretically be extended toward more complete brain-computer integration. Other companies are focusing on life extension through technology in different ways. Alcor and the Cryonics Institute offer preservation services to people hoping for future revival. Nectomy, a somewhat controversial startup, was developing high-quality brain preservation techniques, though they've since pivoted away from human applications. The timeline for any of these technologies reaching practical application remains highly uncertain. Optimistic estimates suggest that detailed brain scanning and simulation might be possible within decades, while more conservative estimates stretch into centuries. Cryonics advocates argue that their approach offers a chance at revival with current technology, though the probability of successful revival remains unknown. What's perhaps most interesting about these technological approaches to immortality is how they reflect distinctly modern anxieties and hopes. In an age where we back up our photos to the cloud and worry about data loss, The idea of backing up consciousness feels almost natural. In a time when we're increasingly comfortable with virtual interactions and digital relationships, the prospect of digital existence seems less alien than it might have to previous generations. Whether any of these approaches will actually work remains to be seen, but they represent something profoundly human: the refusal to accept biological limitations as final answers. If our bodies wear out, maybe we can transcend them. If our brains age and die, perhaps we can preserve or transfer what matters most about who we are. These technological dreams of immortality might sound like science fiction, but then again, so did many things that are now routine parts of modern life. The question isn't whether these approaches are currently possible, but whether they represent plausible paths toward extending human existence beyond its traditional biological boundaries. Have you ever tried to imagine what you'd do with 1,000 years, let alone forever? It's harder than it sounds. Most of us have trouble planning what to have for dinner next week, let alone contemplating activities that could fill multiple millennia. But if we're seriously considering the possibility of human immortality, whether through biological intervention or technological transcendence, we need to think about what forever actually means, both for individuals and for society. Let's start with the practical questions that would arise if aging became optional and death became rare. The first and most obvious challenge would be overpopulation. Earth currently supports about 8 billion people, and demographers project that number will peak somewhere around 10 to 11 billion before stabilizing, assuming current death rates continue. But if people stopped dying of old age, that equation changes dramatically. Even with significantly reduced birth rates, the mathematics of immortality are daunting. If death rates dropped to nearly zero, while birth rates remained even modestly positive, the population would grow exponentially. Where would everyone live? How would we produce enough food, fresh water, and energy? The environmental challenges that already concern us today would become magnified beyond anything we currently face. This leads to uncomfortable questions about who would have access to immortality treatments. If life extension technologies were expensive, would they create a new form of inequality more profound than any we've seen? Imagine a world divided not just by wealth or education, but by lifespan itself. The immortal elite might accumulate not just financial advantages, but centuries or millennia of experience, knowledge, and social connections, while the mortal masses lived and died in relative ignorance and poverty. Even if immortality treatments became universally available, there would be profound social implications. Consider how much society depends on generational turnover. New ideas often emerge from young minds challenging established thinking. Social progress frequently occurs as older generations with different values are gradually replaced by younger ones with evolving perspectives. If everyone lived forever, would society become stagnant, locked into the prejudices and assumptions of earlier eras? The structure of families would change completely. Imagine having not just living grandparents, but great-great-great-grandparents, stretching back for centuries. Family reunions would become logistical nightmares, and questions of inheritance would become incredibly complex. Would marriages still be till death do us part, if death never arrived? How would relationships evolve if they could potentially last for millennia? The economy would face unprecedented challenges. If people worked for centuries instead of decades, would there be room for new entrants into the job market? would we need to completely reimagine concepts like retirement, career development, and economic growth? The accumulation of wealth over centuries could create economic concentrations that make today's billionaires look modestly wealthy by comparison. Education would require fundamental restructuring. Currently, we front-load learning into the first few decades of life, then expect people to work for several decades using that knowledge. But if careers could span centuries, continuous learning would become essential. Would we alternate periods of education with periods of work? Would everyone become a perpetual student, constantly acquiring new skills and knowledge? There are psychological questions too. Would immortal humans become bored? Many people struggle to find meaning and purpose in the few decades of normal human lifespan. What psychological challenges would emerge from facing not just decades but centuries or millennia of existence? Some philosophers argue that death gives life meaning precisely because it's finite. The knowledge that our time is limited motivates us to use it well, to prioritize what matters most, to cherish relationships and experiences while we have them. If death were no longer inevitable, would we lose that sense of urgency? Would we procrastinate forever, always assuming we'd get around to important things eventually? On the other hand, immortality might allow for kinds of personal growth and achievement impossible in normal human lifespans. You could master not just one or two fields, but dozens. You could learn every language, visit every place, read every book ever written, and all the books yet to be written. You could have multiple complete careers, pursue every interest, develop relationships with depths impossible in mortal timeframes. The perspective that comes with extreme longevity might also change human psychology in positive ways. Many of humanity's worst impulses stem from short-term thinking, from the pressure to achieve goals within limited lifespans. Immortal beings might develop longer-term perspectives that could lead to better environmental stewardship, more sustainable economic practices, and more thoughtful approaches to conflict resolution. Then, there are the governance challenges. How do you run a democracy when voters might have centuries of accumulated political experience and prejudices? Would immortal citizens become increasingly set in their ways? Or would extended lifespans allow for more thoughtful evolution of political views? Would we need term limits measured in decades rather than years? Legal systems would require complete overhaul. Currently, we calibrate punishments based on the assumption that life is finite. A 20-year prison sentence means something very different if the prisoner will live for centuries afterward. Would we need to develop new concepts of justice suited to immortal beings? There's also the question of what we do about crime and punishment in an immortal society. If someone commits a terrible crime, how do you punish them appropriately when they might live forever? Traditional concepts of rehabilitation assume that people change over time, but would immortal criminals eventually reform given enough centuries? Or would some forms of antisocial behavior persist indefinitely? Perhaps most fundamentally, we'd need to reconsider what it means to be human. So much of human culture, art, literature, and philosophy is shaped by our mortality. If death is no longer inevitable, would we still be the same species? Would immortal humans develop new values, new purposes, new ways of understanding existence itself? These aren't just academic questions. If current research into aging and life extension continues to advance, we might face these challenges within this century rather than in some distant future. And while the problems seem daunting, humans have shown remarkable adaptability throughout history. We've survived the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations, to industrial nations, to information economies. Perhaps we'd find ways to adapt to immortality too, developing new social structures, new economic models, new approaches to meaning and purpose suited to indefinitely extended lifespans. Or perhaps we discover that immortality comes with built-in solutions to these problems, that the psychological and social changes that accompany extreme longevity naturally address the challenges they create. But one thing seems certain. If humans do achieve immortality, the word forever will take on meanings we can barely begin to imagine. There's something deeply strange about being the only species that knows, from a relatively young age, that we're going to die. But how we think about mortality, how we process the inevitability of our own ending, shapes not just our philosophy but our daily choices, our relationships, and even our mental health. If immortality becomes possible, we'd need to understand how fundamentally this would change the human psyche, because in many ways, awareness of death might be one of the most essentially human characteristics we have. Psychologists have spent decades studying how awareness of mortality affects human behavior, and what they've discovered is fascinating. The knowledge that we will die influences everything from our career choices to our political beliefs, from how we raise our children to how we treat strangers. This field of study, called terror management theory, suggests that much of human behavior can be understood as attempts to cope with the anxiety that comes from knowing we're mortal. Consider how differently children and adults think about death. Young children often don't understand that death is permanent and universal. They might think death is like sleep, that dead people can still think and feel, or that only old or bad people die. This innocent ignorance allows them to live with a kind of carefree presence that many adults envy. But as we mature and fully grasp the reality of mortality, we develop what psychologists call death anxiety. This anxiety isn't necessarily conscious or constant. Most of the time, we successfully push thoughts of death into the background and get on with living. But the knowledge is there, humming quietly underneath everything else, influencing our choices in ways we rarely recognize. We seek to leave legacies, to be remembered, to feel that our lives have meaning. We create art, have children, build monuments, write books, all partly as ways of achieving a kind of symbolic immortality. Different people cope with mortality awareness in different ways. Some throw themselves into religious beliefs that promise continuation beyond death. Others focus on achieving success or fame, hoping to live on in human memory. Still others dedicate themselves to causes larger than themselves, finding comfort in being part of something that will outlast their individual existence. But what happens to these psychological coping mechanisms if death is no longer inevitable? If immortality becomes possible, would we lose some essentially human qualities that emerge from our confrontation with mortality? There's something poignant about the way mortality shapes human love. The knowledge that our time with loved ones is limited makes those relationships more precious. Would immortal love be deeper, having centuries to develop, or would it be somehow less intense, lacking the poignancy that comes from knowing it can't last forever? The relationship between mortality and creativity is particularly intriguing. Many artists have explicitly drawn inspiration from death's inevitability. The memento mori tradition in art, where paintings included symbols of death to remind viewers of life's fragility, produce some of humanity's most moving artwork. Poetry, music, and literature are filled with meditations on mortality. Would immortal beings create art with the same urgency and emotional intensity? Or would endless time lead to a kind of creative complacency? There's also the question of risk tolerance. Currently, people balance potential rewards against the risk of shortening their already limited lives. Extreme sports, dangerous occupations, and risky behaviors all involve calculations about whether the experience is worth potentially losing years of life. Immortal beings might become either incredibly risk-averse, having infinite time to lose, or incredibly risk-tolerant, knowing that any injury or setback is temporary against the backdrop of forever. Mental health would face unprecedented challenges in an immortal society. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders would take on new dimensions if they had to be endured not for decades, but for centuries. Would immortal beings develop new forms of mental illness we can't currently imagine? Would the prospect of endless existence itself become a source of psychological distress? Consider how memory would function across centuries of experience. Current human psychology is adapted to lifespans of several decades. Our memory systems, our emotional processing, our sense of identity are all calibrated to this timescale. What happens to personal identity if it has to maintain continuity across not just decades, but centuries or millennia? Would immortal beings periodically undergo personality changes so dramatic that they effectively become different people while retaining the same continuous existence? The development of wisdom and perspective might follow different patterns in immortal beings. Currently, we associate wisdom with age, partly because older people have accumulated more experience and learned from more mistakes. But there might be a natural limit to how much wisdom any individual can accumulate. After a certain point, would additional life experience lead to greater understanding? Or would immortal beings reach a plateau where further experience doesn't significantly change their perspective? Social relationships would become incredibly complex across extended lifespans. Currently, most people have a few truly formative relationships that shape their personality and worldview. But over centuries, immortal beings might experience dozens or hundreds of such relationships. How would this affect their capacity for emotional attachment? Would relationships become more casual and temporary? Or would the possibility of centuries-long bonds create deeper intimacy than mortals can experience? There's also the question of how immortal beings would handle regret and forgiveness. Currently, the finite nature of life creates natural pressures toward resolution. We're motivated to forgive, to make amends, to let go of grudges partly because we know time is limited. But with infinite time, would these pressures disappear? Would immortal beings hold grudges for centuries? Or would extended lifespans provide more opportunities for healing and growth? The psychology of goal setting would change completely. Currently, we prioritize goals based partly on whether we can achieve them within our expected lifespan. But immortal beings could pursue any goal, no matter how ambitious or time-consuming. This could be liberating, allowing for achievements impossible within mortal timeframes. But it could also be paralyzing, creating endless options without the natural constraints that currently help us focus our efforts. Perhaps most fundamentally, immortality would change how we think about personal growth and change. Currently, we accept that people can change significantly over the course of their lives, but we also assume there are some core aspects of personality that remain relatively stable. Over centuries or millennia, would these assumptions still hold? Would immortal beings be recognizably the same person across their extended existence? Or would they undergo changes so profound that immortality becomes less about preserving individual identity and more about maintaining some form of continuous experience? These psychological considerations suggest that achieving biological immortality would be just the beginning. We'd also need to develop new forms of psychological support, new understanding of mental health, and new approaches to human development suited to indefinitely extended lifespans. The mind, like the body, would need its own form of life extension therapy. Somewhere in the ocean right now, a jellyfish smaller than your fingernail is performing a trick that would make every anti-aging researcher on Earth weep with envy. Nature, it turns out, has been experimenting with immortality for millions of years, and the results are both extraordinary and surprisingly diverse. From jellyfish that age backward to trees older than written history, the natural world offers compelling proof that biological immortality isn't just possible. It's been happening all around us, in forms both tiny and magnificent. Perhaps the most famous of nature's immortals is Turritopsis dohrnii, often called the immortal jellyfish. This tiny, translucent creature, no bigger than a fingernail, has mastered a trick that would make any aging researcher envious. When faced with stress, injury, or old age, it can essentially hit the reset button, reverting from its adult medusa form back to its juvenile polyp stage. It's like a butterfly transforming back into a caterpillar, then growing up again to become a butterfly once more. This process, called transdifferentiation, involves the jellyfish's cells changing their identity entirely. Muscle cells become nerve cells, reproductive cells become digestive cells, and the whole organism starts its life cycle over again with a completely fresh body. In theory, Turritopsis dohrnii could repeat this process indefinitely, making it biologically immortal. Of course, in the wild, most of these jellyfish are eaten by predators or succumb to disease before they have a chance to demonstrate their immortality, which is perhaps a gentle reminder that even biological immortality doesn't guarantee endless life. On land, trees have taken a different approach to longevity. Some bristlecone pines in California's White Mountains have been growing for over 4,000 years, making them among the oldest living things on Earth. These gnarled, weathered trees were already ancient when the Egyptian pyramids were built, and they've survived ice ages, droughts, fires, and countless changes in climate. Their secret seems to be extremely slow growth and remarkable resistance to disease, pests, and environmental stress. What's particularly fascinating about these ancient trees is that they don't show obvious signs of aging. Their wood continues to grow, their needles remain green, and they still produce viable seeds even after millennia of life. Scientists studying bristlecone pines have found no evidence of cellular senescence or genetic deterioration that would suggest these trees are approaching any kind of natural death. In theory, they could live indefinitely if external factors don't kill them first. Lobsters represent another intriguing approach to biological immortality. These marine crustaceans continue to grow throughout their lives, and there's no apparent biological limit to their lifespan. Large lobsters can live for over a century, and their tissues don't show the typical signs of aging seen in most animals. This is partly because lobsters have high levels of telomerase activity throughout their lives, continuously rebuilding the protective caps on their chromosomes that usually shorten with age in other animals. However, lobster immortality comes with a catch. As they grow larger, molting becomes increasingly energy-intensive and dangerous. Eventually, the process of shedding their shell becomes so taxing that many large lobsters die from the stress, making their theoretical immortality more of a practical mortality. Still, the fact that their cells don't age in the traditional sense has made lobsters a subject of considerable interest to aging researchers. Hydra, tiny freshwater creatures related to jellyfish, offer another model of biological immortality. These simple animals consist of just a few thousand cells, but they have an extraordinary ability to regenerate. Cut a hydra in half, and both pieces will grow into complete, healthy animals. This regenerative ability seems to extend to aging as well. Hydra don't appear to age at all, maintaining their cellular functions indefinitely through constant regeneration and replacement of old cells. What makes Hydra particularly interesting to scientists is their simple structure. They lack complex organs and systems, which might make it easier for them to maintain themselves indefinitely. This suggests that biological complexity might be one of the factors that makes aging inevitable in more sophisticated organisms like humans. Some plants have achieved immortality through what scientists call vegetative reproduction. The Pando clone in Utah, a grove of quaking aspen trees, is actually a single organism connected by an underground root system. Individual tree trunks live and die, but the root system has been alive for an estimated 80,000 years, making it one of the oldest living organisms on Earth. The organism continuously sends up new shoots to replace dying trunks, achieving a kind of collective immortality even as its individual parts remain mortal. Bacteria and other single-celled organisms represent perhaps the most successful immortals on Earth. When a bacterium divides, both daughter cells are equally young, and there's no clear sense in which the original cell has aged or died. In a sense, bacterial lineages have been immortal for billions of years, passing genetic information down through countless generations without experiencing anything like the aging process that affects multicellular organisms. But what lessons can humans draw from nature's immortals? One clear pattern is that simpler organisms seem more likely to achieve biological immortality. The most dramatic examples of natural immortality occur in creatures with relatively simple body plans and fewer specialized cell types. This suggests that biological complexity itself might create vulnerabilities that lead to aging and death. Another pattern is the importance of cellular regeneration and repair. Whether it's the jellyfish's trans-differentiation, the hydra's constant cell renewal, or the lobster's telomerase activity, natural immortals all have robust mechanisms for maintaining and repairing their cellular machinery. This reinforces the importance of understanding and potentially enhancing cellular repair systems in humans. The role of environmental stress is also intriguing. Many naturally long-lived organisms seem to thrive in harsh environments that would kill more fragile creatures. Bristlecone pines grow in rocky, nutrient-poor soils at high altitudes. Hydra can survive in conditions that would be lethal to more complex animals. This suggests that controlled stress might actually promote longevity by activating cellular repair and maintenance systems. However, there are important limitations to what we can learn from nature's immortals. Many of these organisms achieve longevity partly by remaining simple and small. the energetic costs of maintaining a complex brain, sophisticated organs, and intricate physiological systems might make aging inevitable in more advanced organisms. There's also the question of whether biological immortality is truly desirable from an evolutionary perspective. Death, after all, serves important functions in evolution, clearing away older individuals to make room for new generations with potentially advantageous genetic variations. Species that achieve perfect immortality might become evolutionary dead ends, unable to adapt to changing conditions. Nevertheless, nature's immortals offer proof that biological immortality is possible and provide clues about the mechanisms that might make it achievable. Whether humans could develop similar capabilities without sacrificing the complexity that makes us human remains an open question. But the existence of immortal jellyfish, ancient trees, and ageless hydra suggests that the dream of biological immortality isn't just a fantasy. It's a reality that already exists in the natural world around us. Perhaps the most radical idea isn't that we could live forever, but that we might not want to. After wandering through all the biological mechanisms of aging, the technological dreams of digital immortality, and the social complexities of endless existence, we arrive at a quietly subversive thought. What if mortality isn't a problem to be solved, but rather an essential feature of what makes life meaningful, beautiful, and profoundly human? This perspective isn't new. Philosophers, poets, and thinkers throughout history have argued that death gives life its shape, its urgency, its sweetness. Without the gentle pressure of limited time, would we cherish anything quite as deeply? Would we love as intensely if we knew that love could last forever? Would we create art with the same passion if we had endless centuries to get around to it eventually? Consider how differently we experience moments when we know they're finite. The last day of vacation feels different from the first, precisely because we know it's ending. The time we spend with aging grandparents carries a poignancy that comes from recognizing its limits. Even something as simple as watching a sunset becomes more beautiful when we remember that we'll only see a finite number of them in our lifetime. This phenomenon isn't just poetic sentiment, it's supported by psychological research. Studies show that people often experience more intense happiness and appreciation when they're aware that an experience is ending. The knowledge of finitude seems to concentrate attention, to make us more present and mindful. If life lasted forever, would we lose this capacity for intense appreciation? There's also something profound about the way mortality shapes human relationships. We form deep bonds partly because we know our time together is limited. We forgive because we recognize that grudges waste precious finite time. We prioritize certain relationships because we can't have deep connections with everyone we meet in the span of a single lifetime. Would immortal beings value relationships differently if they could potentially form thousands of deep connections over millennia? The rhythm of generations provides another lens through which to consider mortality's value. Each generation brings new perspectives, new ideas, new solutions to old problems. Young minds challenge established thinking, not because they're necessarily smarter than their elders, but because they see the world through fresh eyes, unburdened by the accumulated assumptions of decades. If everyone lived forever, would this generational renewal disappear? Would society become locked into the worldview of its first immortal generation? Mortality also creates natural cycles of renewal and growth. In nature, death clears space for new life. Forests depend on older trees eventually falling to make room for saplings. Ecosystems remain dynamic and healthy, partly because individual organisms live, die, and are replaced by others, carrying slight genetic variations. Without mortality, would human society and culture become similarly stagnant? There's beauty in the way finite lifespans force us to make choices. We can't do everything, see everything, become everything we might imagine. This limitation forces us to prioritize, to choose what matters most, to develop distinctive identities shaped by the paths we take and those we don't. Immortal beings with infinite time might face a paralysis of endless options, or they might become so well-rounded that individual identity becomes meaningless. The awareness of mortality has driven some of humanity's greatest achievements. The knowledge that our time is limited motivates urgency in scientific discovery, artistic creation, and social progress. Many people work harder and achieve more because they know their window of opportunity is finite. Would immortal beings maintain this sense of urgency? Or would endless time lead to endless procrastination? Death also provides a natural conclusion to life stories. Currently, we understand lives as narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. This structure helps us make sense of existence, to find patterns and meaning in the sequence of events. What happens to narrative meaning if stories never end? Would immortal lives become shapeless, meandering tales without the dramatic tension that comes from knowing they must eventually conclude? There's also the question of whether suffering and mortality are inextricably linked with the deepest forms of joy and meaning. Many philosophical and religious traditions suggest that the possibility of loss makes love more precious, that the reality of endings makes beauty more poignant. If we eliminated death, would we also eliminate some essential aspects of what makes life worth living? Consider how mortality influences memory and nostalgia. We treasure certain memories partly because we know they represent unrepeatable moments in our finite existence. The bittersweetness of nostalgia comes from recognizing that time has passed and won't return. Would immortal beings experience memory differently if all moments were potentially recoverable through endless time? The legacy concept depends entirely on mortality. We strive to leave something meaningful behind precisely because we know we won't be here forever. We have children, create art, build institutions, and contribute to knowledge partly as ways of achieving immortality through our impact on the world. If we could live forever ourselves, would this impulse to create lasting legacies disappear? Yet perhaps the most profound argument for mortality's value is that it makes each life unique and irreplaceable. No one else will ever see the world through exactly your eyes, experience exactly your combination of joys and sorrows, or contribute exactly your perspective to human understanding. This irreplaceability gives individual lives inherent value and meaning. Would immortal beings, with endless time to experience everything, lose this sense of unique individual significance? But questioning the desirability of immortality doesn't mean we should embrace suffering or refuse the medical advances that extend healthy lifespan. There's a difference between accepting mortality as natural and meaningful and giving up on reducing the pain and disease that can make finite lives less fulfilling. The goal might not be to eliminate death, but to ensure that the lives we do have are as healthy, meaningful, and joyful as possible. Perhaps wisdom lies not in choosing between mortality and immortality, but in recognizing that both possibilities raise profound questions about what makes life valuable. Whether we live for decades or centuries or forever, we still face the fundamental challenge of how to use our time well, how to love deeply, how to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing human story. And maybe that's the real insight from our exploration of immortality, that the question of how long we live might be less important than the question of how well we live. The dream of forever will likely continue to inspire scientists, philosophers, and dreamers. But perhaps the most practical immortality is the one we create through the lasting impact of lives well lived, love well given, and contributions that outlast our individual existence. In the end, whether life lasts 80 years or 800, what matters might be the same: that we pay attention, that we care for each other, that we leave the world a little better than we found it. And if that's true, then perhaps we're already capable of a kind of immortality. Not the biological persistence of individual consciousness, but the ongoing ripple effects of meaningful lives lived with purpose and love. And so, dear friend, we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through the realm of forever. We've wandered through cellular clocks and ancient dreams, through laboratories where scientists chase immortality, and forests where trees have been growing since before recorded history. We've peered into microscopes and telescopes, into the future and the deep past, all in search of an answer to that persistent human question: can we live forever? Perhaps what we've discovered is that the question itself might be more interesting than any definitive answer. Whether through science or technology, through the careful tending of our cells or the bold leap into digital consciousness, the dream of forever continues to shape us, drive us, and inspire us to understand life more deeply. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, you carry within you cells that have been dividing and renewing for decades, DNA that connects you to every living thing that has ever existed, and a consciousness that ponders its own existence. In a sense, you're already part of something immortal. The ongoing story of life on Earth, the endless cycle of matter and energy, the eternal dance of atoms that were once inside stars. And whether our individual stories last 80 years or 800, they're woven into something much larger and more lasting than any single lifetime. Thanks for joining us here at Sleep Science, where every question becomes a gentle path toward rest. Sleep well and dream of whatever forever means to you.